The Sykes-Pickavant Story. 100 years traveling along a long and winding road. With ups and downs, twists and turns, but still going strong in 2025. A timeline from sbarchive.org. Let's set the scene for the start of this story. In January 1921, the first car tax discs are introduced. Unemployment is a serious issue and tops 1 million in February, peaking at 2 million by June. The Ottoman Empire has been dissolved, and nations discuss the problems that arise. The Irish War of Independence is underway, but in May, the province of Northern Ireland is created. Although the war formally ends on July 9th, on the following day fighting between Protestants and Catholics in Belfast result in many deaths and the destruction of 200 homes. Airships are still viewed as the future of air transport, and in June the world's largest, the R-38 makes its maiden flight from Cardington. It explodes 2 months later, killing 44 crew. In September, Ernest Shackleton set sail on his last expedition. On the 11th day of the 11th month, the British Legion launches the first Poppy Day. In the aftermath of the Great War, and the continuing turmoil at home and overseas, J.W.Pickavant register a new company on May 30th. It was 1921. For a few years the horse had been sharing the busy streets of British towns with clattering electric trams and the first horseless carriages. As with so many other innovations, wartime demands had stimulated the development of the motor vehicle. People had quickly come to accept motor vans and lorries, motor buses and charabancs, motor ambulances and fire engines, along with a rapidly increasing number of private motor cars. This fundamental change in transport took place at an alarming rate, and it was soon quite clear that the petrol engine was taking over from the horse, man's prime mover for centuries. Engineers and carriage builders became the first motor manufacturers, turning out a wide variety of different vehicles from small workshops. Substantial importation of Henry Ford's Model T stimulated the early British makers. Mass production techniques were used by Morris, Austin, and others to meet the demand for reliable cars and trucks at prices which made high sales possible. Fuel had been supplied in 2-gallon cans, available from your chemist or ironmonger. Now came the curbside petrol pump fed by our giant Thornycroft trucks adapted to carry 200 gallons at a time. Behind the pumps there developed the first motor repair shops, often operated by bicycle dealers and ex-blacksmiths. Spare parts, tools, and equipment were scarce, but these early pioneers achieved near miracles with their main resources, ingenuity and enthusiasm. The garage trade had been born, and with its inception began the Sykes-Pickavant Story.
Following the grim reality of the Great War, the 1920s roared into life with the exuberance of the Jazz Age. Henry Ford started UK manufacturing at Trafford Park prior to the war. But by the early 20s, capacity limitations led to the acquisition of a new site at Dagenham. In Egypt, Howard Carter discovered the tomb of Tutankhamun in 1922, and in 1927, the American Charles Lindbergh made the first solo flight across the Atlantic in the spirit of St. Louis. Although Lindbergh attracted huge publicity and is often mistakenly credited with the first transatlantic flight, two Mancunians, John Alcock and Arthur Brown, in fact made the first transatlantic flight 8 years earlier in 1919 in a Vickers Vimy, a Great War stringbag bomber. By 1929, Wall Street was heading for a crash and the world was facing the Depression. Cinema films were still silent in the early 20s, with classics like Nosferatu in 1922 and Charlie Chaplin in The Gold Rush in 1925. The Jazz Singer in 1927, with Al Jolson, introduced the talkies.
In Birmingham, two brothers, Justin and Marcus Mendelsohn, came into contact with the motor trade when their family furniture manufacturing business began making timber frame and wood panel coachwork to be fitted to Austin chassis. They saw the opportunities presented by the burgeoning garage trade, and early in 1921 their activity brought them into contact with Jack Pickavant. He was a salesman from Southport, Lancashire, with experience in chemical and hardware products for the motorist. Editor's note: Jack Pickavant, who went by the nickname himself, served in the Royal Flying Corps in the Great War. There's evidence that he first started in business immediately after the war in 1918-19. In addition, there are entries in early motor show catalogues that show both J.W. Pickavant and himself taking show stands alongside each other. It was decided to form a company to market motor accessories, spares and tools under the style of J.W. Pickavant and Company. The other director was, unusually in those times, a lady, Miss M. Baker, who had worked previously with Jack Pickavant and who handled the administrative side of the business for the next quarter century. The new company needed salesmen, and Jack Pickavant remembered a close friend who had managed a retail store in Lytham St Anne's just across the River Ribble from his native Southport. This was Joe Sykes, who in the summer of 1921 became the Northern Counties salesman for the new company. The product range was initially based on accessories and components for the Ford Model T and other popular vehicles. The first Pickavant salesman called on garages, service stations, and engineering shops, as well as the early motor trade wholesalers. The range they offered included such lines as Hassler shock absorbers, Hoodco transmission covers, Bradwell ignition testers, Holleyinks easy starters, and so on. In addition to many proprietary lines, J.W. Pickavant organized the production of an increasing number of tools and accessories under their trade name Quicko. Throughout the 1920s, these aids to safer, cheaper, and more reliable motoring were exhibited at the annual motor shows at Olympia. The enterprising company even had its own traveling display vans to support the efforts of the salesmen.
The Great Depression lasted through the entire decade. Despite this, Ford introduced the Model Y in 1932, Prefect in 1938, and Anglia in 1939. The BBC began regular TV broadcasting from Alexander Palace in 1936, testing both the 240-line Baird system and the 405-line EMI Marconi system that would later be adopted. The outbreak of war curtailed further broadcasting. 1936 also saw 200 unemployed men start the Jarrow March from Jarrow to London. This was just one of a number of protest marches prompted by the unemployment and poverty of the times. In the summer of 1939, the Anglo-Saxon ship Burial at Sutton Hoo was discovered, and the treasures stored in a London underground tunnel for the duration of the war. Cinema-goers were haunted by All Quiet on the Western Front in 1930, then terrified by King Kong in 1933, and cheered on Chaplin in Modern Times 1936.
During the 1930s, the Apkaway brand was developed, and later the Pickavant brand started to appear on the rapidly developing tool range. Interestingly, it was during this decade that the first piece of diagnostic equipment appeared, the Apkaway electrical systems tester for dynamos, starters, ignition, and wiring. In 1939, J.F. Sykes was incorporated, and their first catalogue was published, mainly featuring American tools such as the KD service tools and Van Chrome pullers. Already some overlaps were emerging between the Pickavant and Sykes tool ranges. Some of these tool designs are recognizable as very similar to products that continued in the range right through to the turn of the millennium and beyond.
At the new Ford Dagenham plant, production switched to military vehicles, whilst the redundant Trafford Park factory turned to making Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, many going to the local Avro factory where Lancasters were built. No new civilian cars or trucks were built during this time, and the make do and mend approach was needed to keep pre-war models roadworthy. In 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland and World War II broke out. In 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and the United States entered the war. During 4 months of summer 1940, the RAF fought back against relentless bombing raids by the Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain. In the cinema, audiences were thrilled by blockbusters like The Wizard of Oz, 1939, and Gone with the Wind, 1939. Whilst the looming presence of Citizen Kane dominated the big screen in 1941, alongside Bogey in The Maltese Falcon. Casablanca, again starring Bogey, saw him dodging Nazis in 1942. Playing a very different role, Chaplin told the ominous and perceptive story of The Great Dictator in 1940, a film that still carries a topical message 85 years later.
The war obviously curtailed product developments, but both companies continued in operation despite key management and personnel being recruited into the war effort. This was the time of make do and mend, and fuel rationing. In 1942, the use of petrol for private vehicles was withdrawn completely. Whilst many cars were mothballed for the duration, those vehicles that were kept on the road needed constant repair and maintenance to keep them roadworthy. For the time being, the two companies would have to trade on their pre-war catalogues and ranges. The Sykes-Pickavant Story. 100 years travelling along a long and winding road. With ups and downs, twists and turns, but still going strong in 2025. A timeline from sbarchive.org.
The first full year of post-war production for Ford Dagenham was 1947, and the favourite car of spivs, gangsters and bank robbers, the Ford V8 Pilot, was launched. In 1945, the United Nations were formed to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, to establish conditions under which justice and respect for the obligations arising from treaties and other sources of international law can be maintained, and to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom. In post-war Britain, at the 1948 London Olympics, the Austerity Games, 59 nations were represented at events centred on Wembley Stadium, known at the time as the Empire Stadium. At the Pictures, in 1946, James Stewart, a wartime bomber pilot, starred in It's a Wonderful Life. Bogart is back again, hunting for the treasures of the Sierra Madre in 1948, whilst Orson Welles is back with The Third Man in 1949.
The disruption caused by the war continued well beyond 1945, and much work was needed to revive the vehicles that were built in the late 30s. No doubt there were many difficulties in obtaining spares and repairing vehicles. Although petrol for private vehicles did resume after 1945, it was still strictly rationed until 1950. So far, the SP archive hasn't located any company catalogues or literature for this period, and most likely none was produced. However, if any visitors to the archive have any such material or photographs from this time, we would be pleased to obtain copies.
In the USA, car makers were launching jazzy cars with big fins and chrome. In the UK, Ford launched the Mark I Zephyr in 1951, but also more mundane facelifts and new designs like the 1953 Popular 103E and 1959 Anglia 105E. Following the '48 Olympics, a huge new Festival of Britain opened on the South Bank in 1951 and was possibly most famous for the futuristic Skylon. Following the death of King George VI, Elizabeth became Queen in 1952 with an elaborate coronation in '53, the same year that Hillary and Tenzing conquered Everest. In the '50s, the big screen saw upbeat films like Singing in the Rain, 1952, but also darker movies such as Seven Samurai, that would later inspire The Magnificent Seven. Hitchcock appears with Vertigo in 1958 and North by Northwest in '59.
By the early 50s, the UK motor trade along with the rest of the country was getting fully back on its feet. Sykes-Pickavant published a new catalogue in 1952 and were now operating from the Apkaway Works in Bow Street, Birmingham. The puller range was expanding and now included hydraulic pullers, which would later develop into the famous 1500 series. General-purpose valve spring compressors were being made, along with brake pipe flaring tools and special application tools, like the timing gear extractor for Morris and Wolseley. Another diagnostic tool appeared in the form of the Apkaway tester for Borg-Warner automatic gearboxes.
A stellar decade by any standards. Ford launched a string of new and extremely popular models. 1961 Consul Classic, 1962 Cortina Mark I, 1963 Corsair, 1965 Transit Mark I, 1968 Escort Mark I, 1969 Capri Mark I. Pop music was bursting out with the Beatles leading the rush, forming in 1960 and chart-topping in 1962 with Love Me Do. JFK was shot in 1963, sending shockwaves around the world. In 1966, England wins the World Cup against Germany, an achievement that's never been equalled. In 1969, Concorde takes its first flight, and the first men set foot on the moon. As if the 60s weren't already packed with creativity, a string of blockbusters hit the Odeons, Gaumonts, and ABCs around the UK. 1960, The Apartment, 1960, Psycho, 1962, Lawrence of Arabia, 1963, The Great Escape, 1964, Dr. Strangelove, 1966, The Good, the Bad and the Ugly, 1968, Once Upon a Time in the West, 1968, 2001, A Space Odyssey.
Both the Sykes and Pickavant companies came swinging into the 60s, following the rest of the country into this booming period. In 1960, Sykes-Pickavant launched a new form of customer communications. Their first ever newsletter, and written by their Midlands technical representative, a Mr. Jack Webster, acting as guest editor. In the first issue, this document had no name but instead invited readers to make suggestions. As it happened, the very first piece of motorway constructed in the UK had been completed in 1958, providing a bypass around Preston. This was the first section of M6, and over the next few years more sections of motorway opened around the country. So, the Sykes-Pickavant newsletter was christened Motorway. An important story in the autumn issue of Motorway was the appointment of Walter Douglas to a new role, specializing in the industrial sector and focused on the super heavy-duty Lodestar range of hydraulic pullers, with up to a 100-ton capacity, and using a separate hydraulic ram to provide the motive force. Lodestar pullers were used by many companies including Power Generation and Ministry of Defense. More pieces of test equipment appeared, and in 1963 a new JWP catalogue was published, followed by one from JF Sykes. JFS also started work on a brand new, purpose-designed building at Kilhouse Lane in 1964. This was to serve as both office premises and a factory for assembly and warehousing. The JWP demo van was out and about. Motor shows and industry dinners were attended, but increasingly the ranges of the two companies were overlapping. A brand new factory for Sykes, pending redevelopment of the JWP site in Bow Street, Birmingham, and an unnecessary duplication of products, encouraged the managing directors of the two companies to consider a merger. Curiously, they met to plan the merger at a hotel close by that first piece of M6 to be built near Preston. The fact that the management of both companies had enjoyed a friendly rivalry over many years made the prospect of a merger more palatable. By 1968 the deal was done. The management and staff met for a get-to-know-you conference in the Lake District, and the first merge catalogue was launched.
Ford continues rolling out new market-leading models like the Granada Mark I in 1972 and the Mark I Fiesta in 1976. Later in the decade, the first dramatic technology improvements in 70 years are introduced under car bonnets. Electronic fuel and engine management systems. In 1971, pounds, shillings, sixpences, threepenny pieces and pennies give way to peas. The UK adopts decimal coinage. The terracotta army guarding the first Chinese emperor, Qin Shi Huang, are discovered at Xi'an in 1974. Apple Computer, Inc. was founded in 1976 by college dropouts Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. Their first products were assembled in Jobs' garage. Hollywood was on a roll with yet more giant films opening. 1971, A Clockwork Orange. 1972, The Godfather. 1973, The Sting. 1974, Chinatown. 1974, The Godfather Part 2. 1975, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. 1977, Star Wars: A New Hope. 1979, Apocalypse Now. 1979, Alien.
1971 marked the 50th anniversary of the now-merged enterprise, and to mark the occasion a comprehensive booklet was published, which you can read in detail on the sbarchive.org website. This booklet provided the inspiration and source for much of the material on this video. Peter Hill was in full swing with his sales trips to Australia, South Africa, and New Zealand, continuing to cement the export sales success that had been founded several decades beforehand. In 1971, whilst visiting New Zealand, he enjoyed meeting their Prime Minister, along with Stuart Masters, who was the agent for SP, as well as being a personal friend of Sir Keith Holyoake, the PM. More high-level encounters occurred in 1977 with the visit to St Anne's by HRH the Duke of Kent. The brochure covering this visit can also be found on sbarchive.org. The growth in do-it-yourself activity during this period encouraged SP to present some of the most popular service tools in retail packaging in 1977. This group of service tools grew to around 100 items and was to be found across the UK in the growing network of Halford stores. Another major retailer featuring the new Speedline range was Motorist Discount Centres. The range also found its way into the network of specialist cash and carry wholesalers who served the independent automotive high street shops. For feet-wide display stands were provided to all stockists on a loan basis, though in truth not many ever found their way back to St Anne's.
Ford launched the Sierra in 1982 to replace the Cortina Mark IV. The new aerodynamic design had a mixed reception, nicknamed a jelly mold by some. However, it proved popular and in Cosworth form, highly sought after. The Orion followed in 1989, by which time another technology shift was impacting the motor industry. Emissions controls would fundamentally change all combustion engines forevermore. In 1981, the Space Shuttle made its first flight and went on to undertake 135 missions until 2011. Bob Ballard discovered the Titanic in 1985, whilst undertaking a top-secret US Navy mission looking for 2 Cold War US nuclear submarines. 1989 saw the fall of the Berlin Wall, marking the end of the Cold War, the division of Germany, and the breakdown of the Soviet communist system. Star Wars is back in 1980 with The Empire Strikes Back, whilst Jack Nicholson sends shivers down the spine in The Shining. Harrison Ford appears in several more major films in the 80s, including Raiders of the Lost Ark 1981
Is what makes
and Blade
time
Runner
travel
in 82,
possible.
whilst Martin
Flux
McFly goes
capacitor.
back to the future in 85,
Flux
and Bruce
capacitor.
Willis
It's taken me
doesn't
almost
die
30 years
hard
of my
in
entire
88.
family fortune to realize that.
Harry Enfield's Loads of Money summed up the yuppie decade very well.
If the 60s were swinging, this was the decade when color first appeared to SP catalogs. It was also a period of substantial growth in the product range. By the early 80s, the very popular 318 cooling system tester was dominating the market and was to be found in almost every UK workshop. This product would eventually be used by the AA on all their vans to assist in roadside diagnosis and repair. During the next couple of years, another super popular tool would be introduced, the 270 brake pipe flaring tool. This tool allowed workshops to quickly fabricate sections of hydraulic pipe to repair damaged or faulty sections. Following on from the huge success of Speedline in the 70s, this range was extended in several stages to become a multi-million-pound business in its own right. The display stands were installed by the thousands, no exaggeration. The new hand tools were all professional quality and ideally suited to UK mechanics who invest heavily in their own personal toolkits. The cash and carries found the range very suitable for the independent tool van distributors who had evolved as an alternative source of tools for mechanics who, hitherto, had been spending a fortune on products from Snap-on. In 1986, the Speedline range was awarded the National Automotive Show Award for Best Garage Product of the Year at a ceremony held at the Savoy Hotel in London. Several company acquisitions were made in 85 and 87, followed by a PLC flotation on the unlisted securities market. The timing of this flotation could not have been worse. On a day in October 87 that became known as the Black Monday, the Dow Jones Index fell almost 23%, the largest fall in a single day in history. However, the management team decided to go ahead and duly floated in the following year. Also in 1987, Jack Webster was elected president of the Garage Equipment Association, and an executive aircraft was chartered to fly a group of automotive journalists from London up to Blackpool and then to Birmingham on a factory tour. In 1989, the 25th anniversary of the 1500 series was celebrated at the Cologne Hardware Fair by a presentation to SB's German distributor, Freeweg. The 1500 series, along with other popular pullers and body repair tools, were packaged as promotional packs and proved very popular in the export markets. However, whilst this popularity got the products noticed and distributed around the world, it also attracted copiers from the Far East who blatantly ripped off the designs. From this point on, increasing competition and outright copies would become an enduring feature of the marketplace. A busy decade to say the least.
Ford launched their first MPV outside of North America in 1995, the Ford Galaxy, with the car following in 96 and the Focus in 98. In 1990, the Hubble Space Telescope is launched, and in 1994, Amazon was founded, followed by Yahoo in 1995. Google followed 3 years later in 1998. Dolly the sheep, the first large mammal to be cloned, was born in 1996. The 90s continued to be a very productive period for the film industry, with Goodfellas in 1990, The Silence of the Lambs in 91, Schindler's List in 93, Jurassic Park also in 1993, Pulp Fiction 94, Toy Story 95, Saving Private Ryan 98, and The Matrix in 1999.
If the 1980s were busy for Sykes-Pickavant, the 90s were set to be even busier. A major new product range expansion embraced both the existing range of gauge-based test equipment and an entirely new range of electronic products. This technological leap for the company meant new people, a new factory at Melksham, and a new range of products. Vehicle technology was moving very quickly, necessitating these changes. Electronic fuel and engine management systems, as well as emission controls, were making the old-fashioned spark ignition system a thing of the past. Fundamentally, the car had changed very little since the Model T. The bodywork might look more modern, but the combustion engine and mechanical components had evolved very slowly over 80 years. Now the automotive industry was on the cusp of a revolutionary change, and SP had to change with it. 1990 saw the launch of the ACR Advanced Code Reader. Designed to plug into the new diagnostic sockets that were appearing on new vehicles, this product gave the independent garage an affordable, entry-level way into modern cars. The changes in vehicle design were also presenting independent garages and mechanics with new challenges to their skills and workshop equipment. The ACR was a true innovation and led the UK market for many years, eventually selling thousands of kits. It was a huge success. In 1991, the Suitcase Diagnostics program came together, helping to position the SP brand as a leader in handheld test equipment. Apart from manufacturing new technology, several small businesses who were already in the sector were acquired, including Engine Test Technique, AM Test Systems, and Motor Test GmbH in Germany. Emission test equipment was also added to the range to supply the emerging market for petrol, then diesel, MOT testing. The demand for better, full-color catalogues for both distributors and end-users spiraled during this period. Distributor catalogues were generally in A4 format and eventually ballooned to 364 pages. For the workshop trade, new A5 catalogues were produced in tens of thousands. Following the PLC launch in the 80s, SP had become an attractive target for acquisition, and in 1996 the massive French hand tool manufacturer, Facom, took an interest and purchased the company. Electronic technology products, and particularly the ACR, was of special interest as they had nothing like this in their range. Facom enjoyed a dominant market share of the French hand tool market and was widely distributed throughout Europe as well as other French-oriented overseas markets. In theory, the blend of hand tools and automotive service tools offered a synergistic fit, especially when combined with the joint distribution channels in Europe and elsewhere. Under the Facom brand, the ACR would go on to enjoy a much enhanced access to foreign markets.
Not much new forthcoming from Ford in this decade, except the Cougar in 2008. The noughties started badly with the terror attack on the Twin Towers in New York, and several other disasters were to follow, including the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami and the 2005 London bombings. These problems were then followed by the global financial crisis in 2007 and 8. Europe adopted the euro as a common currency in 2002, and later in the decade, in 2009, the hoard of Anglo-Saxon gold and silver was found in Staffordshire, not far from the UK headquarters for Facom and Brittle. Barack Obama was voted in as the first black president of the USA. Top films of the decade included Gladiator in 2000, the first Lord of the Rings story started in 2001, and the second the following year, and the third in the year after that. Batman returned in The Dark Knight in 2008.
For several years after the Facom acquisition, it was business as usual, with exhibitions and new catalogues plus further development of the ACR. However, in 2005, the giant US-based tool company, Stanley, took over Facom with a primary interest in the hand tool side of the Facom business. Within a short time, the Stanley team determined that the SP business didn't fit, giving a small UK management group the opportunity to buy back this part of the business, thus re-establishing Sykes-Pickavant Limited as an independent UK-based business. Simultaneously, a new business was established in parallel, with the export markets as its focus. Sykes-Pickavant Export is now a completely separate business, though sharing product range and development with the UK business. A fortuitous byproduct of Sykes-Pickavant becoming a standalone UK business is that it has facilitated the achievement of the 100-year anniversary of its foundation, truly a long and winding road. As the newly reborn UK and export businesses consolidate their market positions, new catalogues, products and marketing have emerged. Aside from making a brief reference to these developments, it's beyond the scope of the SP Archive project to relate how these businesses are evolving. Both have live, operational websites as well as social media feeds. Visitors to the SP Archive are encouraged to check them out. Links are provided below.